Node.js community debate intensifies over enabling corepack by default and potentially unbundling NPM. I have actually recorded a video about this already, but I chose to not edit and publish it because so much has been changing since then. I've been talking a bunch with Yag, who works on Node, well known for helping on the performance side, but he also is really invested in this particular cause because corepack was built to keep us from worrying so much about package managers. Right now, when you install Node, you also install NPM, and as such, most things are built such that they can work with NPM. It's become this weird, semi-necessary dependency within Node, and as a result, other options aren't getting what I would call fair opportunity, because you need to have NPM to do anything else. Most things hook into it, and on top of that, when I run something with Node, it expects to have NPM right there, and all these other package managers do a bunch of hacks to work around that. Corepack kind of solves that by letting you run a command and it will check which package manager you chose in the package JSON and run that and install it if you don't already have it. But it's not the default because NPM is the default. As such, there's a handful of members of the Node Technical Steering Committee that have been pushing to unbundle. So let's dig into this article by Socket and see what they have to say. Thank you, Sarah, for writing this blog post. I have done so much research on this topic and I'm excited that somebody's done this already for me. So, a heated debate is happening in the Node.js community over a proposal to enable corepack by default that was opened in November of last year. This sparked the question of whether NPM would be provided through corepack moving forward, as some contributors hold the opinion that the eventual goal of its integration is to uncouple Node releases and NPM releases. Corepack allows developers to use Yarn, NPM, and pnpm without having to install them. Although Corepack is already distributed by default with all recent Node versions, developers still have to run corepack enable to install the required Yarn and pnpm binaries. Proponents of enabling corepack contend that it would streamline the development experience by simplifying version management for package managers. They also argue that enabling corepack by default would offer a more level playing field for alternative package managers, potentially shifting the landscape away from NPM's current dominance and allowing other package managers to gain wider adoption. It's worth noting that NPM firmly opposes distribution through corepack. Miles Borens, commenting on behalf of NPM, stated in no uncertain terms that NPM opposes distribution through corepack. This is the exact quote from Miles. "I support unflagging corepack in any package manager that wants to integrate. NPM does not wish to integrate for a variety of reasons, and we don't want to be forced into supporting this pattern. I wouldn't block any work to enable corepack by default in Node for any other package manager, but I do object to it being used for NPM and for any sort of NPM support being on by default. My request would be that if corepack is enabled by default, that NPM support remains behind an additional flag or command that would be opt-in for developers. If devs want a flow that includes corepack, I personally think they should choose a different package manager developed and designed to use this pattern, such as Yarn. This is the beauty of having an ecosystem of tools. I don't think NPM should be forced to use a pattern it's not designed to utilize." I am about to get opinionated, and this is not against Miles. He's been awesome to chat with. He has been a great representative on behalf of NPM. I've had nothing but great conversations with Miles. Huge shout out to him. I absolutely hate this statement because I agree NPM should not be forced to do things, including forcing me to use it. The issue is that NPM is the default in Node. Every single Node developer has NPM installed. We're forced to install it. We're forced to have it integrated, even if we don't use it at all. I would argue, if you want NPM to be a good experience in Node, that you should have to adopt the patterns that Node uses for integrating package managers. It's just frustrating to me that you can say NPM's hand being forced unfairly when the whole point is that NPM's forcing everyone else's hand unfairly. Borens also cited a number of technical issues with corepack distributing NPM, which he elaborated on in a detailed comment. One is that the jumper pattern introduces extra indirection and a lack of clarity as to what version of the package manager is being used and where it is on the disk. Point two is that pinning the package manager at a project level can lead to exposure to security vulnerabilities. Point three is that a lack of clear testing of Node and package manager versions to update package manager versions is inherent here. Point four is that a hard-coded version for package managers in corepack means adding additional labor for updating. Point five is that you must dynamically install the package manager over the network to even start using a Node project. You can't just have the things on the computer and start. You also now need to fetch the package manager as well. And the final point is that there's a lack of clear benefit to NPM while creating additional work for them. Yeah, delete that. That's not fair. That's the whole point, is that the ecosystem is imbalanced and NPM has gotten a free ride for too long. The rest of these are fair points worth considering and thinking about, but this one is bullshit. Anyways, if enabling corepack by default changes how NPM is distributed within Node, this would defy the wishes of the NPM team by introducing what Borens contends is more complexity and inconsistency without significantly improving the status quo. Oh boy, the NodeJS TSC video. This is the thing I filmed a reaction to. We might splice some clips in from that, but it's long. And when I watched it, it had like 30 views. I'm actually really curious what it's at now, if it's starting to get attention. This was an interesting watch. It's only 290 views. So if you're curious just how niche of a topic this is, there's your answer. Even though the impact of this change is massive, the work that the technical steering committee puts in is huge and really important, and I have massive respect for them and everyone involved in the conversation. It's just crazy how distant they are from what I would call the rest of the JavaScript ecosystem, where it seems like people are much more into shitposting and much less into what's going on here. The question remains whether it even makes sense to add corepack if the goal isn't to remove NPM from the node binary. Is the primary motivation to enable corepack as a way to address the perceived unfairness about NPM's historical preeminence in being bundled by default? Or is the objective to improve the developer experience for those using less popular package managers? TSC member Yag, who, as I mentioned before, has been a great source for me on this topic. He's been letting me know his thoughts for a while now. He's a very vocal proponent of unbundling NPM from Node. He recommended that the committee move to either remove NPM or bundle additional package managers. He suggested that the ambiguity about the situation is creating unnecessary friction. Nisipli, hopefully I'll pronounce this name right, Nisipli contends that Node should be concerned with bundle size and consider the strategic advantages of NPM over other package managers. He's unhappy with users being forced to install NPM in order to install and use other package managers. Without corepack, there is no path to removing NPM as a dependency of the node binary. This is one of the interesting things that came up during that steering committee meeting. The concept of we have two different things we need to vote on. First is, should corepack be the default? And second is, should NPM be removed from Node? And they kept on conflating the two for most of the conversation, but eventually realized these are two separate things they need to make decisions on. And then there's kind of a third thing, which is, if we're not removing NPM, does corepack even matter? Maybe we should just remove that instead, which was a very interesting conversation. I'll leave the link in the description if you're curious. Matteo also had this comment, which is the success of Node is the success of NPM. Don't break the magic combo. He was one of the people pushing back the hardest during that TSC meeting, and I love Matteo. He is one of my favorite people in the JS ecosystem. I respect him highly, and if he is this strong about this, there are clearly things I'm not fully understanding. I've actually been meaning to reach out and sit down and have a deeper convo with him on this because I trust him so much, but he thinks this is a mistake. He has pushed back very hard on it. Matteo was in attendance at the meeting, and he said that shipping a package manager by default is one of the key factors for Node's flourishing success. And he doesn't see a good technical reason to migrate NPM out. One of the main advantages of shipping NPM is the stability of the build. This is an exact quote from Matteo. If you install a Node version, you have absolute clarity on the version of NPM you're going to get, and you can have a clear build. If you use corepack, you don't, and people don't have a clear build. This is a time bomb for maintainers in the ecosystem. This is a point I didn't fully agree on, because you can specify a version of a package manager in your package JSON, which you absolutely should do. At that point, the build is entirely reproducible. You need one more additional binary, but it is a reproducible build. The key here is if you don't specify your package manager in your package JSON, but you do specify a Node version, your build is reproducible. There's a gap here because a Node version is tied to a specific NPM version, so you only have to specify the one number, whereas a Node version isn't directly tied to a pnpm or a yarn version, so you need to specify that additional number. I don't love how this is framed here because this is, I think, a trivial fix, but it is a fair point that projects that don't make that change won't be reproducible builds in the traditional sense. That said, if you don't already have versioning on your pnpm lock or your yarn config or any of these things, you already kind of screwed up. Matteo suggests that the least contentious way forward would be to enable corepack by default and remove NPM support for corepack. This way, the NPM team would not be forced to distribute the package manager through what they consider a technically objectionable method. He also recommends separating out the topic of unbundling NPM, which again, that's an entirely different conversation. I'm happy he called that out. Others in attendance with the meeting did not believe it's possible to remove NPM without introducing massive breaking changes and creating a mountain of frustrated users. Another consideration is that TSC members raised whether corepack is widely used enough to support the Node ecosystem, period. Do developers even know what it is? The committee agreed that they do not yet have a full understanding of the impact of this proposed change. I want to quickly poll the audience to see how many of y'all know what corepack is. And these numbers are scary. And here's Jason Goodison, who's another pretty relevant software dev content creator who has never heard of corepack. A lot of people haven't. I know I've heard a lot about it, but I'm deep in the ecosystem. But even then, I only somewhat recently learned what it actually does. I didn't even know it was part of Node originally. I just thought it was another one of those NVM type things. But corepack is an important development by the Node team as part of NodeJS itself to handle the package managers that you're using. Yeah, so these numbers are telling. It seems like the average JavaScript developer, hell, we're not even average JavaScript developers. We're way deeper than average. If people are hanging out in my live chat on an off day, watching me record videos, this is not representative. This skews more in the know. So the average person at a company that just runs the install command and doesn't think about it, I promise you they don't know what corepack is. Final numbers, 60% don't know, 20% yes, 20% kind of. That's scary. Me reading this issue is not an invitation for y'all to go spam it. If you have meaningful insight on your thoughts on this and replies to important parts of this discussion, you can leave those, but please do not harass or spam any of the people involved in this. They're all working really hard. I'm reading this off of GitHub because that's where the conversation is happening. That is not an invitation for y'all to cause problems. Anyways, here's the enable corepack by default issue on GitHub. I'm sure this will be a civil and healthy debate. Hardfist filled out the template pointing out that they try to use corepack and package manager to force developers to use the pnpm version, but developers always forget to enable corepack, which makes the package manager field not work at all. This is a very important point because we have a package manager key in the package JSON, but it does literally nothing if you don't manually enable corepack first. If you don't run the corepack enable command, this field doesn't do anything. As a result, no one touches this field because for the vast majority of people, it doesn't do anything. The pnpm community has used the engine key instead in order to force this version management in their side, but they have to do things like that because we don't have corepack enabled by default. It's a very, very important point. But once again, I love you, Miles. There's a handful of points in this that I just don't agree with. It's pretty rough. Big one here is the pinning the package manager at a project level leads to security vulnerabilities. So does pinning the Node version. There's no difference here. This is a point that's hard for me to agree with because if Node has a security vulnerability, you upgrade your Node version. If one of your packages has a security vulnerability, you upgrade the package version. If NPM has a security vulnerability, you upgrade Node? That doesn't make sense. And they even say this here. They do security updates to Node whenever the embedded version of NPM has a security vulnerability. This is the problem. This isn't a good thing. Citing this as a reason to not unbundle just feels insane to me. When a dependency has a security issue, you should upgrade that dependency, not some other part that it's bundled in. To me, this shows the vulnerability of NPM and Node being so closely tied. If I'm on a really old version of Node, let's say I'm on Node 16, and NPM has a security vulnerability, why do I have to upgrade my Node version to make NPM secure again? That's terrifying. Even if my old version of Node is perfectly secure and good to go, the fact that NPM is so deeply tied to a specific Node version means that anything that happens in NPM, even if I'm not using NPM, is now a vulnerability I have to worry about. If we keep these things tied together, now I, as a non-NPM user, have to worry about the NPM version that I'm not using. This is an anti-point, not a pro point. One more thing Miles points out here is that a hard-coded version for package managers in corepack is adding an additional labor to updating. Initially, my gut feel around his point here with testing was this is dumb, but the more I think about it, I actually think this is kind of fair. The point is that they have a ton of deep tests making sure that NPM and Node work properly together. Credit where it's due, Miles is finding people who are suffering from issues related to using corepack already. This is a we found on Twitter where somebody aliased npx to use corepack, and the result is they got seg faults when they ran npx, which is kind of crazy. My 2 cents is that corepack simplifies the life of most developers that prefer to use Yarn or pnpm. I also think there's value in shifting the reference implementation within Node. Last but not least, most devs do not specify their package manager field, making reproducible builds harder when used in Docker files and build steps. I fully agree with the first part, 50-50 on this part, then the reproducible build bit I feel is a little disingenuous. This is a chicken and egg, where people don't use the package manager field because it doesn't do anything. If corepack was enabled by default, this field would do something, and then we suddenly will start using it. What? We're talking about an ecosystem that didn't have lock files until Yarn showed up, and now every project has a lock file. Once these things become more standard, we fill in the blanks. And projects that were initialized before corepack was the default will still be using old versions of Node and NPM anyways. And if we do a good enough job of educating the community that they should include a package manager field if you're using a different package manager, I think we're good, especially if both Yarn and pnpm do things like automatically change that when you use the package manager, or throw an alert if you haven't filled in that field. There's a lot of ways that the tools that we're talking about can make this tiny pain point go away really quickly. A community member linked this, and I think it's a really good reply. It's a reply to the point that most devs don't specify their package manager, and that Yarn 1 is responsible for close to 25% of all registry traffic, which is crazy. That's a lot of traffic for a pretty old version of Yarn. And the reason this was brought up is that it proves that NPM being bundled with Node isn't actually hurting alternatives from growing. And I don't think that's fair. They're commenting from their experience, but I'll say this lines up with mine too. These 2 points are only factual because corepack isn't enabled by default. It wasn't until we enforced corepack to manage Yarn that we didn't realize most people were still using Yarn v1 unintentionally. A lot of people who are on the old version of Yarn aren't doing such because they want to be. It's because they don't have a way to enforce which version of Yarn they're using in their code base. But once they enforced corepack at their company, now everybody got off the old version of Yarn. Does it make sense to keep npm in corepack when you can do npm install -g whatever? Maybe. For us, yes, it does make sense because the value is in the package manager field. That takes care of the situation of figuring out which package manager should be used. From my perspective, the problem isn't an installation step problem. The problem is defining the requirements of the package manager. Other people leverage ASDF instead of NPM because having a static tool version is critical to making sure people are using the proper package manager dependency. Basically what package manager solves very well today. Again, the package manager key in the package JSON makes so much sense. Needs to be the default. Oh boy. The big Isaac's wall of text. This will be fun. Isaac's the creator of NPM, and he has a lot of thoughts. We read some of the quote in the blog post, but I want to see his full thing. First, he called out that it's not Node's job to make a level playing field. 50-50 on that. Second thing he points out is that corepack doesn't seem to solve problems other than fairness, and those shouldn't be Node's problems. And yeah, this one I fully disagree on. Specifically, the thing that corepack solves is it makes the package manager key in the package JSON useful. And it should be. If I use that field in my project, then when a developer runs that project, they should either have it run with the right version of the package manager or they should get an error. It shouldn't by default use the wrong thing because they never ran the corepack enable thing. That makes no sense. So I think there's an obvious win here that he is not addressing fair. And then here, Isaac, I love you, man. Why are you doing this? corepack isn't the best, but it's Node's solution. It's part of Node. It can get better. And I think this gets called out in a bunch of places here. The perfect solution fallacy. Like corepack isn't perfect. It won't be for a while, if ever, but it's up to the Node team and the people contributing to Node to make that happen. And if the Node team owns it, they can do that. Oh God, let's not be overly pedantic, just the right amount of pedantic. I don't like the tone of this one. Of course, Node is not a person, and it should be understood that when someone asks, what does Node care about? They're talking about what concerns of the people managing Node do they consider to be chiefly relevant to the Node project. I think I don't like when Isaac talks about fairness. The more he says the word fairness, the less I agree with him. I did not know that Stifle jumped in here. If you guys aren't already familiar with him, he's an employee at Vercel. He is very, very good at what he does. He's in the depths of everything JavaScript. Massive respect for Steven. The fact that his comment was called out here makes a ton of sense. I'm pumped that he showed up for the meeting because he knows better than possibly anybody there how this affects the ecosystem, because he's such a deep ecosystem person. Like, he's not out there contributing to Node in the traditional sense like everyone else there is, but he understands the impact there deeper than possibly anyone else in these meetings. Steven points out that corepack isn't just about the anti-competitive thing, which seems to be the focus of the discussion. It's also solving the problem of choosing the right package manager, which none of these other solutions fix. And he feels like this part's getting overlooked when everyone's complaining about the anti-competitive part. I agree. Very, very important point. And I'm trying to emphasize this point the whole time. There's a huge benefit that has nothing to do with the monopoly aspect. It's purely the idea that that key should work. We don't have a good way to enforce that all the people working on a project are using the same package manager. If you ever had a weird conflict in a lock file, you know how big of a problem this is. Oh God, not Isaac's response to that. Isaac thinks Stifle's comment is a hand wave. I am actively claiming that fairness, or being in any way anti-competitive, is ludicrous as a criteria for Node to do anything. Node should care about the success of Node users, and that's all. It's not at all clear that fairness improves this, or what even should be considered fair in this case. If you were referring to choosing the right version of the package manager, then we need to address the security issues which have been brought up earlier in the thread. Is the goal to make the choice of package manager version solely in the hands of the project rather than the runtime? If so, why does Node ship a package manager at all? You can't just make our argument back at us as though it's a negative. What? I really don't like this point at all. Why is a package manager being treated so differently from a package? Like, if I have an insecure package in my package JSON, that's just as big of a problem as having an insecure package manager in my package JSON. Why are you taking the agency away from the developers to have control of these things? You can't force us. It feels like he's forcing us to argue the negative. We're saying the current state doesn't make sense and has a set of problems. We want the ability to enforce our own patterns, and he's just mad about it. Ugh. Isaac. Again with the pedantry stuff here. This is a common misconception about the loose consensus methodology. Best here means best available, not perfect solution or nothing. For the most part, it seems like people here agree that corepack is worth it just for the package manager key, but Wesley doesn't fully agree here. He points out that he doesn't think a new tool in Node is necessary, The reason I would disagree is it's a little bit too easy to run the wrong package manager on a project. Like, how many of y'all have accidentally run npm install on a project using pnpm or pnpm install on a project using bun? I know I do that at least once a week because I forget which thing I'm using. And if corepack was the default, I wouldn't have to think about these things. I would just run the install command and it would use the right thing. And if I use the wrong thing, I could reasonably get an error from that thing. But none of these tools can be built this way because Node doesn't give us the right defaults to do it. It's genuinely really frustrating that Node hasn't given a happy path for feedback to developers when they're using the wrong thing. Wait, no, they have. It's the package manager key that we can't use because corepack isn't a default. No, this is the same circular thing over and over again. Look, here's an example of an issue in Next where the Docker code wasn't working properly because it would use the wrong pnpm version because corepack wasn't enabled. So they added to the Docker file for Next.js, like their example Docker, the corepack enable command so that it would use the actual version you specify. The fact that these types of PRs have to keep being filed, that the community has to run additional commands before they run the code. This is the problem. If you want to talk about reproducible builds, here's your reproducible build failure. You can't just download a project from GitHub, run the node or npm commands, and expect things to work without corepack being enabled by default. You have to run this additional command or know you've already run it in the past before the projects are actually reproducible. This is a failure. And to not see it as such just genuinely feels disingenuous to me. Unbundling NPM is too contentious to reach a consensus. The TSC will put it to a vote. In most cases for internal project decisions, the TSC operates under a consensus-seeking decision-making model. In this case, the committee agreed that the matter is too contentious and opinions are too diverse for them to be able to reach a consensus. No amount of discussion will lead to an obvious solution. They agreed it should be put to a vote to determine their answer to the following questions. This is what I mentioned before where they broke it up into 3 questions. By the way, this article is phenomenal. This is what I was trying to put together for my video, and it's so nice, so nice that Sarah took the time to write this all up so I don't have to spend way too much time getting all of these points in order. So huge shout out once again to Sarah. I'll leave all her links in the description. Thank you for the work here. This is very important. Also, most people refer blog posts to videos, so I hope this gets the traffic it deserves. Question 1. We agree our goal is to remove NPM from Node. Yes or no? Question 2. We are not going to remove NPM. Should corepack be included in Node? Yes or no? And question 3 is, should we enable corepack by default today? Yes or no? And these are hard questions to answer. I personally don't even have a clear answer here. It's tough. And I'm excited to see what conclusion they come to because I do trust the TSC team to figure this out. The Technical Steering Committee member, Jeffrey, suggests whoever wants to champion removing NPM should write a separate proposal before putting anything to a vote. He said the matter is not urgent and anticipates the earliest anything would happen would be April of this year. The topic hasn't been on the agenda for the last few meetings. 2 weeks ago, Jeffrey suggested that interested stakeholders organize their thoughts and PRs addressing what Node's technical priorities should be in regards to bundled package managers. This is the exact quote from Jeff. I don't think the corepack question is ripe for the TSC to discuss again just yet. Multiple people on that thread have advocated for starting new threads to try and reach consensus on the various open questions. I suggested opening PRs against the technical priorities markdown file to try and establish what goals we're intending to achieve before we move on to the secondary question of choosing the best way to achieve them. I was thinking that those PRs could be one way to organize the discussion that we need to have, or people can just open new issues that are more scoped than the current one. Regardless, there are many open questions, and I don't think this is anywhere close to being ready for the Technical Steering Committee to make any decision. I would agree. This is a very interesting development because it's not like corepack is 100 times better. It's not some big, obvious win. And the impact is negative, but it's not big and obviously negative. I'd say it's like 7 out of 10 important, but also 7 out of 10 potential damage. And that makes it really hard to make a decision about because the level of priority on a thing that's not that big a deal is obviously lower, but is the technical cost low enough to justify doing it anyways? That's a tough balance to find where like this is a win that would benefit a lot of people, but at the same time, it's not that big a win and it has the potential to cause a lot of friction. So while I like the idea of determining the goals first, I think the goals should include the potential cost of doing the thing too. And as nice as it sounds on paper to separate these things, and as much as I actually initially agreed with that, the more I think about it, I think these conversations do need to happen together simply because the win isn't massive enough that we can agree on that first. In the issues on GitHub, Jeff commented that he 100% supports anything they can do to make client access easier, to reduce steps to getting started, to making the experience better, and to level the playing field. I do not support forcing the adoption of corepack to teams that do not want to use it. He reiterated his position speaking on behalf of NPM. Point 1 is that they should ship pnpm plus yarn in the way they want to be consumed. Point 2 is they should unflag corepack if that's the way they decide to do it. Point 3 is they shouldn't force NPM to use corepack. Point 4 is that they should separate the discussion on if they want to dig in and unbundle NPM. Ultimately, the Node Technical Steering Committee will make the decision following more exploration and discussion. If corepack usage proves to be as meager as some suspect, would the committee have the temerity to enable it by default and unbundle NPM against the team's wishes? This seems unlikely, but it is still a topic of discussion. I don't think vendoring yarn and pnpm into Node, the same way NPM is vendored, is a realistic option. It would introduce security issues, bundle size, and would likely not fit well with the lifetime support policy. This was pointed out by the collaborating contributor Antoine Duhamel. He also doesn't think that it would make much sense to discuss unbundling NPM because of the ecosystem impact. If the release team wants that to happen, they could discuss it, but it doesn't seem very productive to go that route. So something we haven't mentioned at all is, why does Node ship with a package manager in the first place? It's a good question, and the creator of NPM, Isaac, had some important things to call out here. Despite conspiracy theories I've seen claiming otherwise, there was no shady backroom deal to get NPM bundled with Node. Ryan and I saw that users were constantly thwarted at the point of trying to get a Node project up and running, and they couldn't do much without a package manager. So we started shipping NPM along with Node. There wasn't any other alternatives at the time, and it was the one supported by a member of the core Node team. So it was the obvious choice. It was discussed in the open, not controversial, people needed it, so we gave it to him. And that was it. What is actually interesting here is that Ryan Dahl, the creator of Node, has a lot of regret about both NPM and how those things were integrated. He thinks the package JSON was a mistake. He thinks the named package imports instead of URL-based imports was a mistake. And Dino was largely built as a response to what he considered failures of NPM's integration with Node. This hasn't dropped just yet, and you can bet your butt I'm going to cover it when it does. Dino's working on an alternative JavaScript registry. So not an alternative to NPM, the command or the package manager, but an alternative to NPM, the place where you install all your packages. This is very interesting. There hasn't been a major player in the package hosting and distribution registry side in forever. So when JSR drops, things will get interesting. And obviously, more coming in that video. Back to the point of NPM being bundled initially, Isaac points out that he doesn't think a level playing field for package managers should be Node's concern, and that should be the community type of problem. And the community should examine whether corepack is the best solution to Node's problems. This is an exact quote. Different OSS projects get different levels of exposure and distribution. So what? This seems like very much not Node's problem. Node should care about the experience of Node users and their success using Node, not whether any given package manager has a fair portion of the market, a market in which no one pays and the winner is rewarded with nothing but costs. That feels disingenuous, but fine. Should Node include an alternative JS engine or TLS implementation because it unfairly privileges V8 and OpenSSL? Fairness is an absurd criteria for a question like this. Ugh. I love you, Isaac, but I got feelings about that one. It's time for Node to formalize its relationship with package managers. This is the opinion of the author, and honestly, I think that's a fair one. Any major changes to the status quo will need to be heavily substantiated, as the long-term impact on the Node ecosystem and development workflow could be forever altered in a way that may not foster the same level of innovation and community engagement. At this level of maturity as a project, it's time for Node to formalize its relationship with package managers in a clear way that is rooted in its technical priorities. This is a quote from Wes Todd in the thread I was talking about before. Beyond that, even in this thread, the question which is at the crux of it being punted on, what should the formal relationship between Node and the various additional tools required to build and run a project be? When folks ask what requirements should be met to be a tool included in corepack, or how it is vetted and decided, there is no clear answer. This is a good point that people have been pulling up in chat this whole time. What if I want to make a new package manager? How do I get it added to corepack? If corepack is this deeply integrated and you end up shipping yarn and pnpm as part of Node itself, how do new things get in? Would they ever agree to include Bun? Because Bun's a competing runtime. This is a tough conversation, and it's important that we get these things right as we figure it out. As the author points out, the Node community is continuing to wrestle with these hot topics of debate, and Todd encourages participants in the discussion to recognize the gift NPM has been to the ecosystem. You know what? I'll triple down on this. Even though I was just saying there's a lot of things that Ryan regrets with NPM, it is one of the best package management solutions of all time. Whenever people complain about NPM, I ask them to reply with the better package manager, and it's very rare they can. I honestly think most of the people who complain about how horrible NPM is have just never worked in something like Python, where pip and managing your dependencies is actual hell. There's a new generation of tools, like the Rust world has Cargo, and Cargo's in a really good state, but that's like a decade after NPM. And probably wouldn't exist if it wasn't for all the work NPM did. The same way NPM probably wouldn't exist if it wasn't for all the work pip did. That doesn't mean pip wasn't horrible, absolute dog water. And it also doesn't mean that NPM is inherently great. But it was a groundbreaking, generational leap in the quality of experience we had managing our dependencies. And it should be called out accordingly, because it was a massive, massive win. One more quote from Todd. I get that NPM has a contentious place in this, as it was bundled before it was ever a for-profit entity. Yes, I understand that it's a fundamentally problematic that the registry we all publish and install from is part of this deal. But that doesn't change the fact that we're all here today with one of the largest software platforms and audiences in the world because of those folks' work. Even with the bumps in the road, the folks who have worked on NPM have given the ecosystem a gift and taken care of their responsibility better than most of us could if we had to. Now is the time to put aside that history and discuss what's best for Node, its maintainers, its users, and the JS ecosystem at large. I was about to say, I hope that's the end, because that's such a great quote to end the blog post on. Huge shout out to Todd. Huge shout out to the author of this article. Sarah, you absolutely killed it. This is such a good resource. The more I look into this and the more I read, the more I'm getting red pilled on the side of YAG. I just don't see why we wouldn't enable corepack by default. It makes things way better for most developers. And as the ecosystem continues to move on past NPM towards tools that make more sense for the different things that we're doing, having a good way to be sure we're using the right version of the things that we're installing is important. The same reason that lock files were important, corepack is important. And if NPM could realize that a package.lock was a good thing, hopefully they'll come around to this too. That's all I have to say here. Thank you guys as always. Peace, nerds.